where we are going to start our webinar on demographic shifts and climate change. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, for some of you. And thank you so much for connecting with us. It is with great pleasure that we welcome all of you to the first discussion panel on climate change outlook, this time dedicated to the issue of demographic shifts and climate change. This is the first discussion out of a series of reorganizing and no-brainer data around the COP26 and beyond. Our goal with this series is to start building awareness on the consequences of climate change for people, communities, for national and local governments, and for civil society in general. In a few more days, as you know, governments of the world will meet in Glasgow, United Kingdom, for the COP26. We know that the implication of climate change will be massive and unescapable and will affect our life in different ways. For example, just last week, the White House published a report on the impact of climate change on migration, where it says that climate change can cause or exacerbate resource scarcity, which drive conflict and induce migration of population in vulnerable situations. People that will be attempting to secure safety or livelihoods elsewhere. And they also say in the report that this unplanned climate-related migration may also induce political instability. I think we all agree that without population, there is not climate change. Our planet, as it is now, cannot be defined only by the physical, chemical, or geographic attributes. But what really matters is the way we as humans have interacted with nature historically, and particularly in the last century. Population is not just the number of people and their growth, which is very relevant, of course. It is also where they live, how they build families and households, and how they and when they migrate. It is also urbanizing all rural areas or increasing the boundaries of current cities. It's about having or not having kids. It's about improving their health to survive or die. All of this is relevant for both climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. And this is why we are here. We want to invite you to discover with us, to discover together the incredible world of demography and why it is fundamental that in the equation of climate change, population dynamics have a place. My name is Jose Miguel Guzman. I'm the president and founder of No-Brainer Data, and it's my real pleasure to introduce you to our stellar and distinguished group of panelists. First, we have Landy Sanchez. Landy is director of and professor of the Center of Demographic, Urban and Environmental Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. She has a PhD in sociology and a minor in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she's a member of various academic and editorial committees in Mexico and internationally. She works on population and environmental issues, as well as in various aspects of social inequality in Latin America, including the relationship between climate change and household well-being, and particularly the impact of extreme events in urban areas, how climate variability impacts across the life course and gender across space, and how demographic and climate change intertwine. Then we have Deborah Balk. Deborah is professor of public affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College at the City University of New York. She's professor in economics and sociology, and she has the PhD program at the CUNY Graduate Center and in the epidemiology and biostatistics department at the CUNY School of Public Health. She's also interim director of the CUNY School of Institute of Demographic Research. She holds an MPP in public policy from the University of Michigan and a PhD in demography from the University of California in Berkeley. She currently serves as a member of the National Academy of Science Committee on Population on the U.S. Census Scientific Advisory Committee, and is co-chair of the New York City Panel of Climate Change, IPCC. Deborah is a leading expert in spatial demography, combining demographic and spatial framework using traditional social science data and linked with satellite data. to examine urbanization and related demographic behaviors, such as migration and health outcomes. She has decades of experience leading interdisciplinary research projects on urbanization, population, and modeling, and vulnerability along the continuum of urban continuum in low elevation coastal zone. Last but not least, we have with us Liwen Yan, who is Senior Associate and Advisor on Population Environmental Risk and Climate Change Initiative at the Population Council. He's also Founding Director and Professor of Asian Demographic Research Institute of Shanghai University. Liwen was scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, and a researcher at the International Institute of Applied Systems, IASA. He taught at Brown University and Peking University. He contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, through working as a lead author on his 5th assessment report and playing other leading roles. He brings a lot of expertise and experience in quantitative research on demographic dynamics and climate change risk, vulnerability, resilience, and mitigation. He explored the sociodemographic determinants of energy transition in the developing world and the urbanization processes and its effect on energy consumption, land use, carbon emission, and wildfire risk. I want to give thanks to our panelists for being here. The program today includes 2 rounds of questions to the panelists, and we have an estimated time of 30 minutes for that. And at the end, we will gladly ask our panelists some questions that you might have for them. Please make sure you write your question in the chat, and I will make sure to address them time permitting. As a reminder, please make sure your mic is on mute. I want to start our first round of questions with asking Liwen, you have been working on integrated assessment of population, environment, and climate change, including modeling where population interact with climate change, and you have been also looking at the impact of urbanization. We know very well the difficulties understanding the link between population and climate change. Can you talk to us about the complexity in understanding that role that population plays in the equation of climate change, in particular in relation to mitigation?
Thank you very much, Jose Miguel. And it's such a great pleasure to be part of this important event. And thank you again for inviting me. So this is you raised a very interesting question. And yeah, that's something like, you know, we know that in almost the global assessment, including climate change assessment, population is always at the root of, as the center for all the assessment, including the climate change research research community. And for a long time, right, and starting from early 90s, population was being used as a scalar for all of the emission assessment. And in the first set of a projection of future changes in climate, population population size was used as the only demographic variable in the climate change projection. But gradually, people understand that it's not only the scale, right, the size of the population, and population work very closely with other aspects, right? Population dynamics is quite complicated, and population work closely with, and you have to look at the production and consumption behavior of the population. And so it's not only the changes in population size, but also the growth rate, and also the changes in population composition by age, by gender, by education, by rural-urban residents, by household composition. So for a long time, sociologists, economists, social scientists contributed to the climate change research and using all models. But to some extent, the climate change modelers did not take into account, to a large extent, did take into account our work, because they use different language, different models, and also because they consider the social scientific studies are rather simple, right? And so that's why we have been working with in an interdisciplinary environment at NCAR, at YASA, work with the physical modelers to understand the complexity of population, the impacts of population dynamics on climate change, and account for the impact of population changes on technology, on economic growth, and on emission and climate, and also think about the possible potential feedback from environmental climate change on population, on human society. So that's something like, we use an integrated assessment model that largely accepted, used by climate change modelers. So that's a very good progress over the past like 1 or 2 decades. I would say during the past 1.5 decades is a golden period for demographers contributed to climate change research. And we are proud that we make some good contribution to understand the complexity and the dynamics. And recently, we contributed to the shared social economic pathway. That's the IPCC new social economic scenarios. And right now at Population Council, we are in the process to launch the community demographic model that will provide the models, the data, and the outputs for understanding the impact of population dynamics on emission and on climate change. So that's the kind of event we expect will happen in about 2 weeks. Yeah, with that, this is I hope this is useful for the discussion.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lewin. Obviously, this is really very, very interesting. Because you have played an important role in all the discussion, particularly with the IPCC, and we will come back to this issue in the next round of questions. But thank you very much. I want to move now to Deborah. Deborah, you have produced publicly available data sets, notably the Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, GRUMP data, and low elevation coastal zone data, both being the first global data set of their kind. Could you tell us the reason you are considering, why considering a demographic perspective helps in planning for adaptation? And because you have worked a lot in the area of sea level rise, could you give us some examples of, practical ways in which you think we can use this information to do better plans and to really help people to adapt to climate change?
Thanks, Jose Miguel. And nice to see everyone here today, friends from around the world. So I, just jumping off a little bit from where Lewin left off, understanding population composition is really important, both for understanding the role of population as a contributor to global emissions. And an important thing about that is that it doesn't matter where that person is in terms of producing, it does in a lot of ways, but every person in the globe contributes to emissions. If you live in, if you live in North America, if you live in Australia, if you live in the South Asia, if you live in Latin America, if you live, in Africa, every single person contributes to global emissions regardless. Like the budget is, there's one budget for global emissions, but that's not true for adaptation. Adaptation tends to be something that we think about locally. And so I see us as having a need to square these circles. So the It's not true that all adaptation happens locally. There's a lot of policy domain on adaptation framing at the national level, and there is a little bit at the regional level, but a lot of it is thought of as things that happen locally. And so when we have a bad weather event, which may be a foreboding of future climate, that happens in a given place. Maybe places that are shared, like all of the coastal communities along from the Caribbean, Mexico, and the east coast of the United States may share a single bad weather event, for example. But those weather events are probably increasingly the cause of climate change, and how we prepare and respond to them is well within the domain of climate adaptation. And where do demographers fit into that? Well, we start again with population composition. It's really, demographers do a really good job, population scientists do a really good job of understanding the role of composition. We know, for example, that the future world will be both more urban, despite the fact that some people argue that maybe cities are dead now, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. But I don't see really strong evidence of that, and they will. As well as the population will become increasingly old. We have a lot of population aging going on, and those two things really impact vulnerability and preparedness in a lot of ways. And so it's important that we pay attention to that stuff and that we use spatial frameworks to get it right. And so I'm going to just, in one tiny blip of self-promotion of me and my research team, I'll stick in the chat a preprint of a paper that will be publicly available along with data and code. And the preprint's already available. The paper will be out in the next week or so, I think, publicly, that you can get the preprint already. On estimating populations, urban and populations and areas in this low elevation coastal zone. And this is work that we started, and the reason I'm telling this story is because it echoes what Lewin has said about this golden age of demographers, of increasing awareness in the population scientific community. So roughly in 2005 or so, we started, a group of us started working on spatially rendering population in urban areas for the first time, and then rendering areas at risk of sea level rise. Now, it wasn't just sea level rise, it was more broadly coastal hazards. As everybody knows, sea level is not going to rise up to, say, 10 meters any time in the near future, and maybe not even toward the end of this century, up to 10 meters contiguous to coast. And that's the level that we used in this data, in this global database. Why did we use such a wide number? Well, storms definitely exceed that. And a lot of planning, local planning boards use like a 5-meter emergency in their emergency management. And of course, what is, again, population community gets this really well. What is 5 meters today may be 10 meters in the future. So because the coastlines may erode or recede or be modified. And so it's useful to have this longer term frame. Now, as we in the population community have done a little bit better to make our data available spatially, although we haven't done as much as we should be doing, I would argue, the community of people who work at estimating coastal hazards has also changed. The people who are measuring using various kinds of Earth observing satellites, whether it's built environment, settlement layers, or night lights, those communities have also been working. And so increasingly, this new data product and analysis, it takes new data sets and it looks at combinations of 4 data sets to measure population, 4 data sets to measure sea level exposure, and 4 data sets to measure a continuum for the first time of urbanization, not just urban rural. And so if I were to open up to where our deficit is thinking about what it means to be urban as a community. We've done a really good job of understanding fertility, mortality, and even migration. Although I would argue that migration, the data sets that we use to understand migration, also really important for adaptation. It's a clear adaptation strategy. We're ill-equipped to understanding residential mobility and migration in the context of climate change, just as we're not really well understanding the context of urbanization fully. Maybe at the scale of abroad systematically we're getting it, but we're not doing or we can do one city at a time, but everything in between we're pretty weak on. So and the reason these things matter is because the future growth of the population is going to take place in the cities and towns of the world, largely in the global south. And so that's really critical. And then, and also when we look at cities in particular, we really have to look at inequalities that exist in them. They have, there are, you know, there are urban-rural inequalities, but cities have also are notorious centers now for exacerbating existing inequalities in places. And it's no surprise, I think, to many that climate hazards often in some places tend to really occur in places where there is disproportionate impacts of inequality will be felt to communities to communities at risk, both in social terms and in environmental terms. And it's important that we use spatial frameworks and critical demographic tools to get at that. I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's where we should be aiming to go. And with that comment, I'll stop.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. I think that the work that you have been doing is helping to illuminate these linkages and how important it is to have data and quality data at the disaggregated level in order to make possible these estimates. I want to move now to Landy. Landy, you have done an extensive research on the implication of migration policy and poverty in Mexico. Mexico is a very important country, not only because of the linkages with US, but also because it's an important reference for Latin America, and particularly in the area of research. So, because you have done this extensive research, linking the heterogeneity of household in terms of size and composition to impact and responses to food and energy constraints, could you share with us the result of your research? How you think these results are relevant for policymakers in Mexico to help them to make better decisions on dealing with climate change?
Thank you, Jose Miguel. I'm very happy to be here in such a good company today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on what are the impacts of climate change in households in Mexico. And this is a project that I started precisely with Lewin and Brian O'Neill and the group at NCAR some years ago, using an integrated assessment model who basically what it does is to link an Earth model, and that means all the changes that happen in the Earth system, with an economic model and a population model, the IPCC model, who precisely try to look at how households are going to respond to changes in the climate. And what we did is to try to understand better how changes in temperature and precipitation and other changes in the Earth system are going to impact agricultural productivity. And what we found for Mexico is because what we did is to try to develop a model for Mexico within the global framework of the models. That means that we are well run in the other countries and regions of the world at the same time. And what we found for Mexico is that, in fact, Mexico is going to be quite affected by the middle of the century, right? But around the 40s and 50s of this century. And we found that agricultural productivity is going to decrease, and that yields also increments in food prices, which is also happening in other countries, but the size of the effects for Mexico is larger. And that depends basically on the kind of crop that we have, dependency a lot on corn, which is very sensitive to temperature increments. And also because we have low irrigation system in Mexico, right? Around 50% of the crops depends on temporary irrigation. And that makes us quite a bit vulnerable to these kind of changes in the weather. So we found that the food prices are going to increase considerable, about 50% only because of climate change. I mean, the model controls for other type of changes to the future, but we attribute to climate change an increment in 50% in food prices. And that also we also find another kind of changes in, for example, in energy, because we also model at the same time how the energy matrix is going to change into the future, right? We expect as the climate change effects take place, that we are going to move from certain type of fuels to another kind, right? We are going to start leaving behind fossil fuels and we're going to start using other kinds of fuels. And Mexico is a highly dependent country in fuels, as many other Latin American countries. So that also produced some increments in energy prices. And that, in general terms, produced a decrements in consumption for households. Urban and rural households diminish their consumption of food and energy. But what we found interesting is that there are differences in how much. In terms of food, rural and urban households differ on how much they are impacted. On the one hand, without mitigation, they more or less have the same kind of impacts. But when you put in place a mitigation policy, then in food, actually urban households are more impacted, and also particularly in energy, urban households have a higher impact than rural ones. And then we were puzzled because more of the time rural households tend to be more impacted, right? And so what we did is to look at why that would be the reason. And on the one hand, it's obvious in the sense that the level of consumption is higher in urban areas, right? So when you see the total impact in the sense of how much accumulates the impacts of losses, then you can see that urban, because they have a higher level of consumption, will be the ones who lost the most. But on the other hand, it's also because the kind of fuels that use urban households are the ones who are depending more on subsidies related to fossil fuels. So when you start changing the type of, when you have a mitigation policy in place, for example, that will imply that the price of carbon will be increased in the future, right? And that will become worse for urban households. So the question will be, so shouldn't we implement now a mitigation policy because it's going to be worse for households, and particularly for some urban households? The answer, of course, is not, right? We need a mitigation policy because that will decrease the impacts in food, because then we will not have the impacts in agriculture as higher, and they will be better for food production. But what the key policy implication of our research is that we need transition, social policies that help out in the transition. That we cannot just implement mitigation and put prices in carbon without implementing a social policy that help out those urban households who are going to be impacted the most. And we need to identify that. And part of our research actually help a little bit with that, because we can identify, for example, that the impacts of climate change will depend on the residency, on the household size, and the main source of income. That's what we found with our research. And also, I want to highlight that precisely for that, we need more research that look into, for example, the composition of the household in more detail, the age structure of the household, so that we can actually develop social policies that protect those who are going to be more in need into the future.
Thanks a lot, Landy. I think that this is very relevant because in the case of Mexico, we know that there will be impact. We know that also Mexico, you know, we have one of the biggest cities in the world, Mexico City. And I think the way we deal with that, it will be very relevant, not only locally, but also globally. I would like to move now to second round of questions and trying to go a little bit more in details in some of the issues we have discussed. And going back to Lewin, you know, with climate change affecting everyone in different ways, there is no doubt that in order to mitigate climate change in all the sectors and adapt to climate change, all the sectors need to be involved. How you see this link between research and academia in terms of helping to better integrate, with governments, private sector, civil society organization, in order to work better toward the net zero goal. How you see this connection between these different sectors could be helpful, and particularly take into account what will be the result of COP26, in which governments are supposed to make commitments, and hopefully strong commitments to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, definitely. This is a very important question. And climate change is happening and will affect everyone, not only in the developing country, but also in the developed country. What happened recently in New York, in Germany, in Belgium, right? So we know that we need the effort across the globe. And so right now, with the climate change and IPCC and UN FCC promoted to a 1.5 or 2 degree or 1.5 degree. That's something like, a big challenge, and also very relevant, very important for the world. So due to persistence of the carbon concentration, the global climate change is inevitable, is happening, and will continue to happen. And even if we stop population growth or largely reduce the population size to a large extent, to limit the temperature increase below 1.5 or 2 degrees, will largely rely on technology advancement, including geoengineering technology, carbon capture and sequestration in our economic system. So that will need the collaborations between the developing, the North and the South, and to promote technology advancement in the less developed country. So that's something like, definitely we need a joint efforts. And so 1.5 degree, 2 degree target is important, and population maybe in that case will not play a key role, to be honest. But however, it does not mean that population dynamics does not matter, right? Yeah, many research, including ours, show that demographic trends play a key role in future carbon emissions and climate change. So for instance, meet unmet need of reproductive health services of women and protect the reproductive rights in both developed and developing countries will make a difference in reducing energy use and emission. It will also allow countries to invest more in public health and education. That will also help foster technology advancement and adaptation, right? And reduce carbon emission. Meanwhile, improving standard of living and enhancing resilience and adaptive capacity. So as we are trying to help to promote the understanding of the scope of the climate change impacts. So we finished this global social economic scenario SSPs. Now we are working with local government and try to extend the analysis to the local. And we, for instance, we make subnational population projections for many countries in Asia, in Latin America, and now starting to work also in Africa. So try to help them to understand the importance of the collaboration, and understand even in New York City, we were trying to also work with the New York City government to generate different scenarios of future changes so that the policymakers understand the importance of population dynamics and its contribution to emissions and working with different sectors. Yeah, that's something like, Deborah can see more because she's leading that effort.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we will look forward to, having access to all these tools that you are being developing. And I think they will be extremely helpful at the country level and the regional level. Now, I want to continue with Landy, back again. Landy, everybody say that we need more and better data. Even some people are suggesting that we should develop or build a climate change data ecosystems. For a population perspective, what kind of data do you think is needed, and who should provide it? And what can we do to improve not only its availability, but also its use? And I'm thinking in concrete, what's happening now with, the fact that because of COVID, so many countries has postponed some of their statistical activities, like the census, that we know is the key data source for a lot of things we can do in terms of mapping vulnerability and adaptation. So could you tell me a little bit about that, how you think this issue of data and how is it really relevant for all of us?
Yeah, well, Lewin and Deborah for sure can tell a lot about that because they have been at the front of developing a lot of the data sets, the global data sets on this. I will say two things. One is that in the last decade, I think we have made huge improvements of having available data globally for studying climate change, both on the population sides, but also I will say in the interaction between population and climate change. Particularly, I think we have gained a lot on the ability of integrate variables about climate variability, extreme events, and large-term impacts of but at the same time, it's also striking to me that we are still lacking some basic data in some areas, right? So, for example, I think we still need, as Deborah was saying at the beginning, we still need to improve our spatial and temporal resolution of the data. And particularly for the adaptation and vulnerability assessment, we still need a lot of information. And I'm going to give you just an example in the area that I have been working. For example, to understand better the impact of extreme climate events, we, in many areas of the world, we still don't have the basic information, which is the segregation by sex and age at this fine scale resolution. We just don't have that data, right? Or we don't have, for example, mortality and impacts data on disasters by sex. There is no information whatsoever on it. So those kind of things that are basic information, demographic data, we need to build that with that information. And it's true what you say that without the census data, in many countries, we are lacking a very important piece of information precisely to go down in the resolution of the information that we need. And for adaptation, as Deborah just explained, it's key to have that information at that very high resolution. The other thing that we could improve is to have better panel data at spatial scales, at different spatial scales, right? We need to build these data sets that allow us to follow places and areas along time. And we need to put together systems in order to understand better what are the impacts over time, now and into the future. I mean, we need to develop projections that are also a spatial projection of people. And we have some now. For example, we have the Brian Jones and Brian O'Neill spatial projection, and there are other urban projections out there, but need to improve what are we projecting, the age structure and everything in the fine scale. Again, it's not that there are no projections of population, but it's the scale at what they are projected. And the last thing that I'm going to say is that we also need to better integrate longitudinal data that we are very good in collecting in demography, in the sense that we collect life histories, we need to collect biographies and all those kind of things, but we need to integrate into that information about how the weather is changing on those, or how was the weather before and how now is changing, so that we can actually study what are the impacts along the life course of people. Of extreme events, climate, and so forth and so forth.
Yeah. I think this is a clear message in terms of how we should work on this issue. And don't forget, because the experience we are having now, for example, in terms of COVID-19, is an example of how bad we were prepared to deal with, dealing with monitoring and looking for the impact of COVID. And the same could happen with climate change if we don't prepare ourselves. Before I consider some of the questions from the participants, I'd like to give you the floor to Deborah to discuss an issue that I think is extremely relevant. It's in terms of, we are talking a lot now about inequality, leaving no one behind. And this is being part of all the discussion on climate change too. In some cases, we are able to convey the message, but in others, we are not necessarily good in saying clearly to policymakers the relevance of population dynamics, demographic behavior, demographic change in terms of climate change. So from the lens of a social scientist you are, in your opinion, are we making progress toward a more justice and equity future in the context of climate change?
Thanks, Jose Miguel. I'm going to start answering that by just connecting a little bit about what Leywin and Landy have just said about data. Good data and good data infrastructures are a really critical part of ensuring well-informed policy, and that communities who need data get those data. So we have a lot of translation to do to make sure that, and Leywin talked about tools, Landy talked about adaptation and mitigation strategies. Those can't happen without the right data. And those often need to happen by very local agencies and local bodies, sometimes non-governmental even, that if there aren't publicly available data for them, they're never going to be able to generate it itself. But in addition to that, I think for anybody in this community who's here and who has an opportunity to engage with a statistical infrastructure on many of us may be here because we're data users, but if you're here, if you're a data user, I encourage you to engage with a data producer. And if you're a data producer, talk to the data users, because I would argue that the demographic data infrastructure, which, it represents the 20th century really firmly. And here we are in 2021, and we're still using an old infrastructure for our data. I know that we're making modifications to sort of adapt it in some ways, but whether it's a survey or a census or even demographic surveillance systems, those are largely framed around making sure that we have national representativeness in our data structures, which are, of course, really important. We all understand that now, but now we need to be able to, as Landy was saying, have the temporal and spatial scale of those data sets be able to address the questions of the 21st century. And there's one thing that we know we need to be looking at, and that's climate change. And you can't do it without fine-grained, both spatial and temporal scale. And I'm afraid that our community just is not contributing enough to that domain. There may be areas where we're not going to contribute to it. We may not look at daily movement of people. That may be something we choose not to do. But if we want to know if people are migrating from between national borders or within national borders, this is something we know how to do. We just don't do it with respect to we haven't framed it in the context of being able to think about climate change. And we are always retrofitting, and retrofitting those data are much less useful for anybody who wants to use those data than thinking about them and being thoughtful in planning to get those data correct. I know it takes a long time to change those infrastructures. I think we're behind the ball on that, and I think we should rapidly be engaging in those conversations. To talk about just a little bit more of the policy domain, per se, or what's going to happen in Glasgow. That I'm not going to. Well, we all read the news and we know where the U.S. is going to be on that, not where it should be. Let us just say, as a leader in this, it will not be where it should be. But I would not say that we are without hope, because one of the things I have the privilege of doing is being a co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change. Here we have a major city in the world. It's not the only one. There are many other cities around the world that are really engaged in, by local law. New York City runs an assessment just like the national climate assessments that occur around the world and the IPCC. And these kinds of assessments are really engaged in, at the present time, have really taken the mandate of trying to make sure that the future, that planning for the future is equitable and racially just and so forth. And those concerns, I believe, at a local scale are getting full consideration. We have a lot of work to do, but everybody recognizes as a first step, not only that it's important, conversations are in those domains are happening, and the data requirements are being clearly articulated for those. So it's not like it's an easy task, but it's at least in the imagination of individuals working in that domain. And this cuts across a wide range of actors, both those who are in government, but those who are in community organizations and other kinds of non-governmental agencies that are, so it's a much more, I would say, holistic sort of approach to understanding things. Whereas at the national level, and we see this also when we pay attention to cities, like a lot of the work on understanding cities and climate change has occurred through these by cities coming together and realizing that they need to exchange information and data and so forth. So I think it's, this is, I would say that, making progress toward a just and equitable future is happening more organically and in spite of the policy, the official political policy domain that is out there.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Clearly, when we deal with climate change, we need to consider those two, at least, of ways of dimension in that we need to consider. First, it's like the geographical dimension from the global level to the community level, and what you're saying is what is happening. It's maybe at the central level in a government there are not many things happening, but at the level of the cities there are a lot of work. It happened also in the United States. There are very good work doing in some of the states, and particularly in some cities. And I think the other dimension is the actors that are being involved, from the people, from the civil society to the national governments and local governments, but also in terms of the private sector and the firms, because they are mandated to report in terms of their emission, and that is not happening always. But there is an increased recognition to the need to make mandatory requirement for firms to inform about emissions. So I think we have had a very interesting discussion. I want to, we have from a participant, in particular from Robert Engelman, a question. Hi, Bob, how are you? And he said that perhaps for Lewin, he is referring this question, but any one of you can say that. But he said that, what is the state of research on demographic sources for GHG emissions other than from fossil fuel CO2? For example, from deforestation and forest degradation, soil degradation, methane and industrial chemicals. Lewin, if you want to reply to Robert Engelman.
So could you repeat? I didn't get the full scope of the question. So, and you were talking about what the status of the research population on. Okay.
Let me give Robert the possibility to ask himself the question.
Okay, thank you, Jose. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you, Lewin, as well, and all of you. I'm wondering about research on greenhouse gas emissions other than fossil fuel CO2. We hear a lot about per capita emissions analyzed by CDAC and British Petroleum and others on fossil fuel CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, but we seem to know much less about emissions around the world, demographic factors that affect, for example, deforestation, so biological or vegetation CO2, as well as other, non-CO2 gases such as methane and the nitrogen oxides and industrial chemicals. I'm wondering if there is ongoing research on where these emissions are coming from, to what extent they contribute to greenhouse gas warming, and what are some of the demographic factors involved with them? How is that research proceeding? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Yeah, you're right. Definitely, the climate change research community knows much better about carbon dioxide, fossil fuel emission, the greenhouse gas emission from fossil fuel use. Fortunately, over the past 1.5 decades, the research community put a great effort to understand the greenhouse gas emission from land use, and there's a global land use project, and leading by a group of scientists from New Hampshire, from GTCRI, and from YASA to review the empirical research, and to understand, also do a kind of a global model analysis to understand to what extent the land use changes contribute to greenhouse gas emission. And in fifth assessment report, right, there is some changes in the understanding, and put it in the contribution of greenhouse gas emission and from land use in the range of 15 to 20%. So that's something like that people know much better than before now. And in the new socioeconomic scenarios, the shared socioeconomic pathway and land use modeling and group and work together, and to put more efforts to understand to what extent land use changing, deforestation, soil degradation, and agricultural production contribute to the short-term and long-term greenhouse gas emission. And that's something that in progress.
Yeah, thanks, Lewin. I think it's very important to also know from what's happening at the level of emissions, in which this is an area in which I think we need to, and we can work a little bit more as from a demographic perspective too. I want to give, before we finish, and we have only 3 minutes left, just the possibility to our panelists to have 1 minute each if you want to say something additional to what you have not been said, or something that you want to add to the discussion. Elandi?
Maybe I would like to stress the need to understand better gender dynamics in general. I think you have been in one of the panels that we have in El Colegio about the gender difference in climate impacts. I think it matters in many domains. We don't understand very well we have a general understanding about what are the difference, but we don't understand very well yet how, for example, what are the difference in climate impacts, for example, across the life course. How does it matter for children? How does it matter for adolescents? How does it matter for all other adults? And there are quite a bit of evidence, for example, about the difference on heat waves and the physiological response, the difference between men and women, and so on and so forth. So I think in general, we don't have a good understanding on the gender dynamics of these impacts. And also, we don't understand very well what are the kind of policies that we should implement, if any, taking into account that. And again, I would say that this aspect about recovering the life course perspective that is so strong in demography, it will be also really relevant to understand precisely the accumulative impacts of climate change, because for the most part, many of the type of events that we are looking at are actually accumulative. Even in the extreme climate events, there are only few who are really these humongous events that we see, right? The hurricane and those kind of things. Many of the extreme events actually are repetitive events every single summer, or like heat waves, right? And so we need to understand better how they accumulate across the life course. And of course, I'm not going to end without saying that we need better data and better spatial data and better training in demography to handle those kind of information.
Thanks, Landy. Deborah.
Well, just picking up right there where Landy left off, I will add that, you know, not only do we need better demographic data, demographers need to contribute to that conversation and engage with the communities of people who are not demographic. Everybody wants demographic data and related socioeconomic data that demographers have been working toward, and the frameworks for understanding those data, whether it's a life course perspective or for example, that's a perfect example. And those kind of people who work on the environmental side of the house or on the nature-based solutions side of the house, all really relevant. They're going to want these data. And if we can't provide them, they're going to go out and use whatever they can find. So it's up to us to not only provide them, but to provide them and be involved in the engagement of the analyses with them. More integrated work, but that means we do a better job of what we're doing in the first place, and we have to cross over our comfort zone, learn a little bit about how they want to use them and bring it back and make our data relevant to them. I see that as a task that we have to take to heart. And the other thing, both within that community and more globally, and certainly this pandemic has proven also as a useful instruction for this, is we need to be comfortable with communicating uncertainty. There will be a lot of uncertainty associated with climate change. Demographers know about uncertainty. We live in that domain. Any population forecast is bound by uncertainty. And this is something that, but nevertheless, you know, you look at how many people take the medium long-term projection without even looking at any of the others. It's just one of the many. So I would argue that we have to do a better job on that score too. So. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. I fully agree on that. Finally, Lewin, you have like 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I agree totally with Landy and Deborah, and we need to cross the aisle to reach out with to do a multidisciplinary research and understand not only what demography can do. We also need to understand what the need from our physical modelings and policy arena, and also provide cross-scale, and subjects, scientific evidence for policymakers, for publics.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it has been a wonderful discussion and a meeting. And this is, remember, this is the first meeting that we're organizing. We will come back soon, and we'll invite you for a second meeting on climate change outlook. So thank you very much to you panelists, Landy, Deborah, Lewin, for your time, your dedication, and for the work that you are doing that is extremely useful and relevant for dealing with climate change. So thank you very much also to all the participants for the questions, and we will be in touch. Have a good day. Bye-bye.